Can you explain what activist investing is? You've been talking about investing and then looking at companies when they're struggling, stepping in and reconfiguring things within that company and helping it become great. So that's part of it, but let's just zoom out. What's this idea of activist investing?
I think recently, in the last couple of days, I read an article saying that more than 50% of the capital in the world today that's invested in the stock market's passive, indexed money. And that's the most passive form, right? So if you think about an index fund, a machine buys a fixed set of securities in certain proportion. There's no human judgment at all. And there's no real person behind it, in a way. They never take steps to improve a business. They just quietly own securities. What we do is we invest our capital in a handful of things. We get to know them really, really well because you're going to put 20% of your assets in something, you need to know it really well. But once you become a big holder, and if you've got some thoughts on how to make a business more valuable, you can do more than just be a passive investor. So our strategy is built upon finding great companies in some cases that have lost their way, and then helping them succeed. And we can do that with ideas from outside the boardroom. Sometimes we take a seat on a board or more than one. And we work with the best management teams in the world to help these businesses succeed. So when I first went into this business, no one knew who we were, and we didn't have that much money. And so to influence what was to us a big company, we had to make a fair bit more noise, right? So we would buy a stake, we'd announce it publicly, we'd attempt to engage with management. The first activist investment we made at Pershing Square was Wendy's. I couldn't get the CEO to ever return my call. He didn't return my call. So we actually, in that case, our idea was Wendy's owned a company called Tim Hortons, which was this coffee donut chain. And you could buy Wendy's for basically $5 billion. And they owned 100% of Tim Hortons, which itself was worth more than $5 billion. So you could literally buy Wendy's, separate Tim Hortons, and get Wendy's for negative value. That seemed like a pretty good opportunity, even though the business wasn't doing that well. So we bought the stake, called the CEO, couldn't get a meeting, nothing. So we hired actually Blackstone, which was at that time had an investment bank. And we hired them to do what's called a fairness opinion of what Wendy's would be worth if they followed our advice. And they agreed to do it, paid them a fee for it. And then we mailed in a letter with a copy of the fairness opinion saying Wendy's would basically be worth 80% more if they did what we said. And 6 weeks later, they did what we said. So that's activism, at least an early form of activism. With that kind of under our belt, we had a little more credibility. And now we started to take things and stakes in companies. The media would pay attention. So the media became a kind of an important partner. And, some combination of shame, embarrassment, and opportunity motivated management teams to do the right thing. And then, beyond that, there's certain steps you can take if management's recalcitrant and the shareholders are on your side. But it's a bit like running for office. You've got to get all the constituents to support you and your ideas. And if they support you and your ideas, you can overthrow, if you will, the board of a company. You bring in new talent and then take over the management of a business. And that's the most extreme form of activism. So that's kind of the early days and what we did. And a lot of the early things that we did were call it what we call sort of like investment banking activism, where we'd go in and recommend something a good investment bank would have recommended. And if they do it, we make a bunch of money, and then we moved on to the next one. And then we realized an investment in a company called General Growth was the first time we took a board seat on a company. And there it was some financial restructuring and also an opportunity to improve the operations of the business, sit on the board of a company. And that was one of the best investments we ever made. And we said, okay, we can do more than just be an outside the boardroom investor, and we can get involved in helping select the right management teams and helping guide the right management teams. And then we've done that over years. And then I would say the last 7 years, we haven't had to be an activist. An activist is generally someone who's outside banging on the door trying to get in. We're sort of built enough credibility that they open the door and they say, hey, Bill, what ideas do you have? So welcome. Would you like to join the board? We're treated differently today than we were in the beginning. And that is, I would say, some people might just call it being an engaged owner. And that, by the way, that's the way investing was done in the Andrew Carnegie, JP Morgan days, 150 years ago, right? You had these iconic business leaders that would own 20% of US Steel. And when things would go wrong, they'd replace the board and the management and fix them. And over time, we went to a world where mutual funds were created like in the 1920s, 30s, index funds with Vanguard and others, and that all these controlling shareholders would, kind of gave their stock to society or their children and multiple generations, and there were no longer kind of controlling owners of businesses, or very few. And that led to underperformance and the opportunity for activists over time. And what activism has done, and I think we've helped lead this movement, is it restored kind of the balance of power between the owners of the business and the managements of the company. And that's been a very good thing for the performance of the US stock market, actually.
So the owners, meaning the shareholders.
Yes.
And so there's a more direct channel of communication with activist investing between the shareholders and the people running the company.
Yes. So activists generally never own more than 5 or 10% of a business. So they don't have control. So the way they get influence is they have to convince the other, but they have to get to a sort of a majority of the other shareholders to support them. And if they can get that kind of support, they can behave almost like a controlling shareholder. And that's how it works.
So the running of a company is, according to Bill Ackman, is more democratic now.
It is. It is. But you need some thought leaders. So activists are kind of thought leaders because they can spend the time and the money. A retail investor that owns 1,000 shares doesn't have the resources or the time. They got a day job. Whereas an activist's day job is finding the handful of things where there are opportunities.
So on average, is it good to have such an engaged, powerful, influential investor helping direct the direction of a company?
It depends who that investor is, but generally I think it's a good thing. And that's why, one of the problems with being CEO of a company today and having a very diversified shareholder base is the kind of short-term, long-term balance. Mm-hmm. And you have investors who have all different interests in terms of what they want to achieve and when they want it achieved. And CEO of a new company hasn't had, a new CEO of an old company, let's say, hasn't had the chance to develop the credibility to make the kind of longer term decisions, and can be stuck in a cycle of being judged on a quarterly basis. And a business, the best businesses are forever assets, and decisions you make now have impact 3, 4, 5 years from now. In order to make, and sometimes there are decisions we make that have the effect of reducing the earnings of a company in the short term, because in the long term, it's going to make the business much more valuable. But sometimes it's hard to have that kind of credibility when you're a new CEO of a company. So when you have a major owner that's respected by other shareholders sitting on the board saying, hey, the CEO is doing the right thing and making this expensive investment in a new factory, we're spending more money on R&D because we're developing something that's going to pay off over time, that large owner on the board can help buy the time necessary for management to behave in a longer term way. And that's, I think, good for all the shareholders.
So that's the good story, but can it get bad? Can you have a CEO who is a visionary and sees the long-term future of a company, and then an investor come in and have very selfish interest in just making more money in the short term, and therefore destroy and sort of manipulate the opinions of the shareholders and other people on the board in order to sink the company, maybe increase the price, but destroy the possibility of long-term value?
It could theoretically happen. But again, the activist in your example generally doesn't own a lot of stock. The shareholder bases today, the biggest shareholders are these index funds that are forever, right? The BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Their ownership stakes are just, at this point, only growing because of the inflows of capital they have from shareholders. So they have to think, or they should think, very long-term, and they're going to be very skeptical of someone coming in with a short-term idea that drives the stock price up, in the next 6 months, but impairs the company's long-term ability to compete. And basically, that ownership group prevents this kind of activity from really happening.
So people are generally skeptical of short-term activist investors.
Yes. They're very few. I don't really know any short-term activist investors.
That's a hopeful
not ones with credibility.